There exists a single question that cuts through every form of irrationality, every evasion of logic, every attempt to validate contradiction. If you held a false belief, how would you know it was false? This question is devastating because it forces the thinker to acknowledge the standards by which falsity is detected. And in that acknowledgement lies either the restoration of rationality or the exposure of complete intellectual collapse. When someone claims that contradictions can be valid, that truth is relative, that logic is merely conventional, or that their beliefs transcend rational criticism, ask them this question. Watch what happens. They must either, one, appeal to some standard of falsity detection, thereby admitting rational standards exist, or two, admit they have no way to know if their beliefs are false, thereby confessing intellectual bankruptcy. Or three, attempt to evade the question, thereby revealing they understand the contradiction. There is no fourth option. The question is inescapable. To answer, how would I know if I held a false belief, requires identifying a method of falsity detection. And every method of falsity detection ultimately depends on one principle, the law of non-contradiction. Falsity is detected by recognizing contradictions between what is believed and what is true, between premises and conclusions, between beliefs held simultaneously, between predictions and observations, between statements made at different times. All falsity detection reduces to identifying that A and not A cannot both be true in the same respect. This is not one method among many. It is the only method. Without the law of non-contradiction, the very concept of falsity becomes meaningless. This is not merely a feature of how minds work. It reflects the structure of reality itself. Contradictions fail not because we dislike them, but because reality will not accommodate them. A bridge cannot both bear weight and not bear weight. A medicine cannot both cure and not cure the same condition in the same patient. The principle that exposes a building's instability is the same kind of principle that exposes a theory's incoherence. Both collapse when they assert what cannot be true in the same respect at the same time. In every case, the failure traces back to the same underlying fact. Reality is never the opposite of itself. Falsity detection works because reality is constituted by identity and excludes contradiction. When we detect falsity, we are recognizing a collision between belief and that which contradicts it. And this collision has force because reality is not self-contradictory in its constitution. The question, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, goes beyond cognitive method. It probes the basis on which thought can be measured against a reality that is not self-contradictory. When we ask someone, how would you know if you held a false belief? We are forcing them to acknowledge their dependence on the law of non-contradiction, the very law they are likely trying to evade or deny. Consider what happens when someone tries to evade the authority of logic while maintaining they are thinking rationally. The conversation follows a predictable pattern. Stage 1, the claim. The thinker asserts something that contradicts logical principles. Perhaps they claim truth is subjective, contradictions can exist in reality, logic is just Western thinking, some truths transcend logic. Stage 2, the challenge. We point out the contradiction or ask them to justify the claim. Stage 3, the defense. They attempt to defend their position using logical argumentation, thereby employing the very principles they're denying. Stage 4, the exposure. We ask, if your belief were false, how would you know? Stage 5, the collapse or correction. At this point, they must either acknowledge standards of falsity detection, correcting their position, or validate contradiction to avoid acknowledging those standards, thereby collapsing. If they choose collapse and declare that contradictions can be necessary or valid to defend their position, they have destroyed their ability to detect any falsity whatsoever. Let's trace exactly what occurs when a thinker, backed into a corner, decides to validate contradiction rather than acknowledge logical standards. The initial defense. My position only contains a performative contradiction. I must use logic to argue against logic's universal authority, but this contradiction is necessary for my critique. The fatal move. In calling the contradiction necessary and valid, the thinker has simultaneously claimed the contradiction exists, A. The contradiction is valid, acceptable, making A true. But the law of non-contradiction states that A and not A cannot both be true. If contradictions are valid, then this law is violated. And if this law is violated, there is no way to detect falsity. There is no way to even establish contradiction itself. And so the question returns. If this belief were false, how would you know? They're trapped. The thinker cannot answer without acknowledging the law of non-contradiction. But they've just declared contradictions valid. Therefore, if they say I know by detecting a contradiction in my reasoning, they've admitted the law of non-contradiction is absolute, thereby contradicting their position. If they say I have no way to know if my belief is false, they've admitted intellectual bankruptcy. If they say contradictions don't indicate falsity in this case, they've eliminated all falsity detection, thereby equalizing every assertion, thus turning all meaning into nonsense and noise. But the moment contradiction is valid, the thinker loses the ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood, between correct reasoning and incoherent nonsense, between insight and delusion. They are trapped in total logical isolation. Some might object, but paraconsistent logics handle contradictions without explosion or collapse. Dialecticism even claims some contradictions are true. This misunderstands what paraconsistent systems actually do. They restrict inference rules to prevent deriving everything from a contradiction, avoiding explosion. But they do not validate contradictions as both true and acceptable in belief or action. More fundamentally, even dialecticism must employ metalogical consistency to define its own system coherently, to distinguish valid from invalid inferences within the system, to maintain stable semantic interpretations, to communicate its claims intelligibly. Every paraconsistent system presupposes the foundations of the logical laws at the meta level to establish its own framework. The system itself cannot be described, defended, or applied without assuming the law of non-contradiction governs the description of the system. This means paraconsistent logics cannot be used to undermine the authority of non-contradiction in actual thought and reality. They presuppose it to exist as coherent systems at all. The question, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, applies even to advocates of paraconsistent logic. They must detect falsity in their reasoning by identifying contradictions, or they have no falsity detection mechanism. When a thinker validates contradictions, 4 catastrophic failures occur simultaneously. A, falsity detection fails. Before validation, falsity is detected by identifying contradictions. This argument is flawed because it contradicts itself. Standards exist for distinguishing valid from invalid reasoning. After validation, contradictions no longer signal falsity. Any criticism can be both accepted and rejected simultaneously. No standard can determine correctness because contradictions are permitted. The thinker can no longer answer, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false? Because the mechanism of falsity detection has been destroyed. B, identity collapses. Before validation, terms have stable meanings. A refers to A and not to not A. Communication is possible because words maintain identity. After validation, terms can mean themselves and their opposites. Valid can mean both valid and invalid. Communication becomes impossible because no word has determinate reference. The semantic consequence is that if contradictions are valid, meaning itself collapses. Words that mean everything mean nothing. Language degenerates from a tool of precision into mere noise. The thinker may continue to speak, but their words no longer point to stable realities. They float free, attaching and detaching from reference arbitrarily. If contradictions are valid, the thinker cannot maintain that their position is anything definite because identity itself has been destroyed. C, rational isolation becomes total. Before validation, external criticism can reach the thinker. Evidence can challenge beliefs. Argument can change minds. After validation, all external input can be simultaneously accepted and rejected. Evidence both supports and undermines every position. Argument becomes impossible because contradictory responses are equally valid. The thinker is locked in a solipsistic loop. They cannot be reached by reason because reason itself has been abandoned. Most frighteningly, they have no way to tell whether they are spinning in a void of error or moving toward truth and meaning. Rationality is not static, but self-corrective. The scientific method, philosophical dialogue, mathematical proof-checking, peer review, all depend on the capacity to detect and repair falsity. Rationality is the only method humans possess for systematic self-correction. Validating contradiction abolishes the mechanism by which minds repair themselves. The thinker becomes permanently isolated from the only process that could restore their connection to truth. D. Coherent action becomes impossible. Before validation, decisions are justified by reasoning. Plans can be evaluated for consistency. Goals can be pursued systematically. Means and relationships hold stable. After validation, every decision is simultaneously justified and unjustified. No plan can be evaluated because contradictory outcomes are both acceptable. Goals lose meaning because achievement and failure become identical. Action becomes arbitrary motion without rational direction. The thinker cannot act rationally because action presupposes that this path leads to the goal, while that path does not. Deliberation requires distinguishing better from worse options. Choice requires that selecting A means not selecting not A. When contradiction is valid, all paths are simultaneously correct and incorrect. All choices equally justified and unjustified. An engineer who validates contradiction cannot build a bridge. Every specification would be both met and violated. A physician cannot treat a patient. Every intervention would be both effective and ineffective. A parent cannot guide a child. Every method would be both helpful and harmful. Practical rationality collapses entirely. The thinker may continue to move through the world, but their actions are no longer guided by reason. They have become a creature of habit, impulse, and accident, dressed in the language of deliberation. The beauty of asking, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false? Is that it can trigger recognition even in a thinker who has validated contradiction. Consider this exchange. Question: if your belief about validating contradiction were false, how would you know? I would know if my reasoning led to a contradiction. Question: but you've declared contradictions valid, so how can contradictions indicate falsity? Well, the law of non-contradiction is still the ultimate standard for detecting falsity. Question: then contradictions cannot be valid. Which is it? At this moment, the thinker confronts the inescapable choice. 1. Reaffirm the absolute authority of the law of non-contradiction, rational restoration, or 2. Admit there is no way to detect falsity, intellectual death. There is no third path. The question forces clarity. Understanding why intelligent people validate contradiction reveals a broader pattern of irrationality. The process unfolds in a predictable psychological sequence. It begins when a cherished belief is challenged. Someone points out that the belief commits them to a contradiction, and the thinker suddenly confronts a threat, not to logic, but to something personally or emotionally significant. Next comes the experience of discomfort. Acknowledging the contradiction would require revising or abandoning the belief, which often feels like a loss of identity, security, or moral certainty. The contradiction does not threaten reason, it threatens comfort. In response, the mind generates a defensive reaction. Rather than surrender the belief, the thinker declares the contradiction acceptable, necessary, or profound. This maneuver protects the belief at the cost of destroying rationality. The irrationalists will also simply try to deny that a contradiction is a contradiction, which is easy for them because contradictions don't quite seem to register in their comprehension. And then comes rationalization. The thinker reframes their concession as philosophical depth. This is a sophisticated position. Classical logic is limited. Truth transcends mere consistency. These claims serve not to illuminate reality, but to shield the belief from criticism. At this point, the trap closes. By validating contradiction, the thinker has disabled their own falsity detection mechanism. They can no longer distinguish correction from affirmation, error from truth, or criticism from support. Rationalization replaces reasoning, and there is no remaining path back to rational discourse. In this moment, the thinker reveals what they value more than truth. They choose comfort over coherence. They prefer the preservation of beliefs they like to the preservation of the ability to know when their beliefs are false. They choose the feeling of being right over the power to detect error. This is not merely a cognitive mistake. It is a failure of intellectual virtue. The core intellectual virtues all presuppose the ability to detect when one is wrong. Honesty requires acknowledging contradictions when they appear. Humility requires accepting correction. Courage requires facing uncomfortable truths. Fair-mindedness requires applying the same standards to oneself that one applies to others. To validate contradiction is to undermine not only thought, but intellectual character itself. A thinker who accepts contradictions becomes incapable of practicing the virtues that make rational inquiry possible. They preserve their comfort, but they lose their capacity for truth. This pattern appears everywhere. In politics, how would you know if your ideology were false? If they cannot answer, they've chosen ideology over reality. In science, how would you know if your theory were false? If they cannot answer, they've abandoned the scientific method. In personal belief, how would you know if you were deceiving yourself? If they cannot answer, they've chosen self-deception over honesty. In philosophy, how would you know if your argument were invalid? If they cannot answer, they've chosen rhetoric over reason. In public discourse, how would you know if your claims were false? If they cannot answer, they've chosen persuasion over truth. The question works universally because all domains of thought depend on falsity detection, and all falsity detection depends on the law of non-contradiction. When contradiction is tolerated at the societal level, the consequences extend beyond individual rationality. Polarization intensifies. When each side validates its own contradictions, no shared standards remain for resolving disputes. Dialogue becomes impossible because no one is bound by consistency. Propaganda flourishes. Once contradiction is normalized, rhetoric needs no connection to truth. Claims can be simultaneously asserted and denied depending on convenience. Conspiracy epistemology spreads. When contradiction is acceptable, any counter-evidence can be incorporated without changing belief. The conspiracy theorist can simultaneously claim the absence of evidence proves the conspiracy because it's hidden, and the presence of evidence proves it because it is revealed. Institutional breakdown accelerates. Courts cannot function when testimony can be both true and false. Markets cannot function when contracts can be both binding and non-binding. Governments cannot function when laws can be both enforced and ignored. The question if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, applies to cultures and institutions as much as to individuals. A society that cannot answer it has lost the capacity for collective self-correction. For a thinker who has validated contradiction, whether explicitly or through evasion, restoration requires complete, unconditional reaffirmation. Step 1 is recognition. I cannot know if I hold false beliefs unless contradictions indicate falsity. Therefore, contradictions cannot be valid. Step 2, rejection. I reject utterly the claim that any contradiction can be necessary, valid, or acceptable. That claim destroys my capacity for rational thought. Step 3, a reaffirmation. I reaffirm absolutely the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. These laws are not negotiable, not contextual, and not flexible. They are the conditions of rational thought itself. Step 4, application. Because all these laws are absolute, any belief that contradicts them must be false. I will revise my beliefs to eliminate contradictions regardless of how uncomfortable that revision may be. Without all 4 steps, restoration is incomplete. The thinker remains vulnerable to collapsing back into validation of contradiction when convenient. The question, if I held a false belief, how would I know it was false, should become a regular practice for anyone who values truth over comfort. Before asserting something confidently, ask, what would show me the belief is false? When defending a cherished belief, ask, am I explaining or rationalizing? When dismissing criticism, ask, what if the criticism is valid? The question becomes most valuable precisely when we least want to ask it. When beliefs are deeply held, emotionally significant, or socially important. These are exactly the contexts where validation of contradiction is most tempting. The mark of intellectual honesty, of an honest intellectual thinker, has a clear answer to, how would I know if I held a false belief? The dishonest thinker evades the question or declares it doesn't apply to their special case. Special pleading. Some might think these concerns are relevant only to abstract philosophical debates. This is profoundly mistaken. Every consequential decision depends on falsity detection. Engineers must know if their calculations contain contradictions. Physicians must know if diagnoses conflict with symptoms. Judges must know if testimony contradicts evidence. Citizens must know if political claims contradict facts. Scientists must know if theories contradict data. Parents must know if methods contradict children's well-being. If individuals or cultures began treating contradictions as negotiable, the consequences would extend far beyond theory. Engineering would fail universally because contradictory specifications would make it impossible. Patients would die because contradictory test results would be treated as needing no resolution. Justice would fail because contradictory evidence would make evidence impossible. Democracies would collapse because the valid affirmation of contradictory claims would make it impossible to defend democracy. Science would stagnate because contradictory theories would be maintained as equal. Human suffering would flourish because the world would become irrationally dangerous. The question, how would I know if I held a false belief, is not academic. It is the question that determines whether thinking is functioning or broken. Ultimately, validating contradiction is not an error within thinking. It is the destruction of thinking itself. Thinking requires distinguishing true from false, detecting falsity, correcting mistakes, distinguishing reality from imagination, recognizing contradictions. Validating contradiction destroys all these things. A thinker who has validated contradiction may continue to experience mental activity. Words may form, arguments may be constructed, conclusions may be reached, but this is not thinking in any meaningful sense. It is mere rationalization as the impossibility of rationalization. It is the noise of cognition without its substance. The question, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, exposes this completely. If the answer is, I wouldn't know, or contradictions don't indicate falsity for me, then thinking has stopped. Only the appearance of thinking remains. The laws of logic are not options or preferences. They are not cultural artifacts or arbitrary conventions. They are the conditions of rational thought itself. If the question, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, is devastating precisely because it forces acknowledgement of this fact. Every answer leads back to the law of non-contradiction. I detect a contradiction. Admits the law's authority. I have no way to know. Admits intellectual bankruptcy. Contradictions don't apply to me. Validates contradiction and destroys thinking. There is no escape. The question reveals that we either submit to the laws of logic or abandon rationality entirely. There is no middle ground where contradictions can be selectively validated while thinking remains intact. The choice is binary and inescapable. Either we submit to logic and retain the very capacity to think, or we evade logic and annihilate it. Either we preserve falsity detection, or we surrender the ability to tell truth from error. Either we accept that contradiction signals falsity, or we concede that we have no way, none at all, to know when any of our beliefs are false. The thinker who cares about truth will choose submission to logic every time. Not because logic is an external tyrant demanding obedience, but because logic is the internal structure of rational thought itself. To reject it is not to transcend it, but to cease thinking coherently. To ask, if I held a false belief, how would I know it was false? Is to bind oneself to reality, to commit to living in truth rather than comfort. This is not merely an intellectual discipline, but an existential stance. The capacity to know depends on the capacity to be corrected. Without the willingness to discover false beliefs, without the mechanism to detect them, knowledge becomes impossible. What remains is only belief, sincere, perhaps deeply felt, but disconnected from any reliable process of verification. To lose the capacity for falsity detection is to lose oneself. The thinker becomes a prisoner of their own mind and impulses, unable to distinguish their thoughts from reality, their preferences from truth, their rationalizations from reason. They may continue to feel certain, even righteous, but they have severed the connection between certainty and correctness. The question, if you held a false belief, how would you know it was false, stands as the ultimate test. Do we value the capacity to think truly, or merely the freedom to believe comfortably. Answer it, and we safeguard the very capacity to think. Evade it, and we declare, whether we admit it or not, that our thinking has already surrendered.